All right, here we go. Yeah, I should keep my glasses on in this case. Acquiring the relics. So we were on how Mosiah had moved from the land of Nephi up to Zarahemla. We had then talked about how he was a type of Moses, a prophet, priest, and king, and anointed one, so also a type for the coming Messiah, similarly to how Moses would have been a type and a shadow for Jesus as well. Now we're talking about how we acquired the relics, and that's what I'm interested in. So, while Mosiah I apparently acquired the interpreters himself and made these part of the Nephite regalia, it is unclear how he obtained the relics that had belonged to previous kings of Nephi's dynasty, namely the brass plates of Nephi, the sword of Laban, and the Liahona. As Don Kazier asked, if Mosiah was not the king when he left the land of Nephi, the question arises as to how he happened to get the large plates of Nephi, which obviously accompanied him to Zarahemla. See Donald Arthur Crazier's A Study of Nephite and Lamanite and Jaredite Governmental Institutions and Policies as Portrayed in the Book of Mormon. The most immediate answer would be that Mosiah I was guided to take them from those unworthy to retain them in their now unholy temple. This had precedent. We know from Nephi, first of his dynasty, that he was led by God to steal the Josephite relics, brass plates and sword of Laban, from the otherwise lawful possessor, that a nation should not dwindle and perish in unbelief, 1 Nephi 4:13. Though Nephi is silent on how he took the brass plates and Liahona when fleeing from his brothers, 2 Nephi 5:12, the Lamanites from then on are wroth with him because he departed into the wilderness, and took the records which were engraven on the plates of brass, for they said that he robbed them. Mosiah 10:17 and Alma 20:13 and 54:17. If Mosiah I had similarly taken the temple relics to protect them from destruction and prevent his own people from perishing from unbelief, he would have had Nephi as an exemplar. Strengthening the parallels to Nephi even further, Mosiah I would have then brought the relics, particularly the brass plates, to the Mulokites, who offer us a perfect counterexample of what would have happened if Nephi had not taken the brass plates from Laban, or if Mosiah I did not take them from the previous king. The Mulokites, unlike Lehi and Nephi, who left Jerusalem at the same time, had brought no records with them, and therefore they denied the being of their creator, Omni 1:17. By following in the footsteps of his ancient father Nephi, Mosiah I not only ensured that his own people would have the scriptures to maintain their beliefs, he was able to restore the beliefs of another people who had long lived without them. No fewer than 3 commentators have raised the question of how Mosiah I had access to the royal treasury and perceived legitimacy in taking the relics, each suggesting it may have been through his kinship. That comes from Crazier's Second Witnesses and Miner's Out of Bondage Through Covenants. That's who he's referring to when he says people had suggested it was through their kinship. Yet, as we have seen, Mosiah I was not the dynastic heir. A possible explanation that one has also been used to account for Mosiah I's unusual non-inherited rise to kingship is that Mosiah I was linked to the previous dynasty by marriage. Footnote, since Mosiah rose to non-inherited kingship over both the Nephites and the Mulokites, marriage to the daughter of a Nephite king or the Mulokite king could help account for his rule of either of those groups, respectively. Val Larson in his Footsteps, Ammon I and Ammon II. That's also from a personal communication from Rand Gardner, email of November 12th, 2019. See, I brought up that marriage thing about him coming into the Mulekites and being a king that way. So at least I got half of it. I didn't think of it on the Nephite side, which would complicate things. To me, I would think that maybe since Mosiah the First was named religiously prominently, because as Joseph Smith nearly identically called him Messiah instead of Mosiah, I wonder if he was like religiously a strong high priest, just like Aminadai was the one who read the writing on the wall in the Nephite temple. I wonder if he was related to him. And so, because everyone universally recognized that that was a good and important thing, don't know. I mean, that's why we're guessing here, all of us. So, the Book of Mormon offers at least one case of becoming king by marriage. Amalickiah obtained the king. That's his name. Amalickiah. He's the. Why do I have a hard time remembering? I should not. It's Amalickiah. Amalickiah the evil one. The absolutely dastardly, nasty, horrible, awful, evil dude of the Book of Mormon. The one who is like the epitome of everything horrific in trying to seek power and murder to get gain. Amalickiah, jeez, obtained the kingdom of the Lamanites, among whom he had no standing by blood, and was acknowledged king throughout by marrying the Lamanite queen. That's Alma 47:35. Well, Lehite dynasty, and I also brought that up, Amalickiah, his marriage. While Lamanite dynasties are patrilineal, this case suggests that when there is no male heir, men may become kings through marriage. Footnote says the presentation within Mosiah I's story of the 8 Davidic royals, in essence 4 kings and 4 queens, may have intertwined with the role of Mosiah I's wife as queen in founding the Nephites' own dynasty. If Mosiah I, so that's a pretty good conjecture. If Mosiah I did accede to kingship by marriage, he had good biblical precedent. David legitimated his dynasty by marrying Saul's daughter. Michael, and linking into previous dynasty, a Mosiahan replay of these events, would be particularly apropos in the context of Mosiah I's David-like rise to accompanying the old king's Saul-like decline. Footnote says David's wife, Michal, and brother-in-law Jonathan deceived Saul to protect David and assist his rise to kingship by clothing David with Jonathan's own garments and sword, representing a transfer of power from Saul's line to David's. An incident Alan Goff finds echoed in Nephi's account of clothing himself in Laban's garments as he takes Laban's birthright relics. See 1 Samuel 18:4 and 19:11-13. Alan Goff, how should we read then? Reading Mormon scripture after the fall. With Mosiah I's ancestor Nephi disguising himself to acquire the brass plates, it is possible that Mosiah I followed Nephi's example to get access to the relics. So again, he's still throwing in conjecture about he could have disguised himself, he could have stolen it, he could have been married. All fairly reasonable. I personally would think, because of Mosiah I's descent to kingship among the Mulekites, I think he married into that one. I would doubt that he would have a plural type marriage to obtain that. So unless something happened to his first wife, I would think that he was not married when he left and obtained them by either dressing up or stealing them or knowing someone. something like that, or having a right to be in them because maybe he's a high priest of the area after the order of Aminadai. Well, that would be my guess, but that's what we're trying to figure out. In the same funny way, I was thinking about how David and Saul and their interplay with how things were married to their ascent to power versus the decline of Saul. Sorry, I was trying to remember what it was, and I got distracted by the footnote that there was another parallel about marriage and ascending to kingship through marriage. I know there's parallels to the ancient wedding ceremony. I know there's Further suggesting Mosiah the First's possible marriage to the daughter of a king is a multifaceted inversion of Mosiah the First's life, in that his great-grandson Ammon II, cutting off of arms, because he declined marrying the daughter of Limhi. Likiah is the bad guy. I gotta remember that. Mosiah the First, like David, founded his family's dynasty. Ammon II ended it. Mosiah the First left the land of Nephi to save the Nephites by traveling northward to the land of Zarahemla. Ammon II left the land of Zarahemla to save the Lamanites by traveling southward to the lands adjoining Nephi. There, Ammon II was invited to marry a king's daughter, Alma 1724. If inversion continues, then Ammon II not marrying the king's daughter would inversely point to his great-grandfather Mosiah marrying a king's daughter. While such a marriage is hypothetical, pending further evidence, it would have explanatory power in understanding Ammon II as his typological inversion, and in helping to account for Mosiah I's access to the relics of Nephi's dynasty, his accepted legitimacy in acquiring those relics, and his success in establishing his own dynasty. Footnote says, a latter-day parallel to Mosiah I's marriage to the king's daughter, enabling him to acquire the Nephite dynastic relics, and possibly later the interpreters, would be Joseph Smith's marriage to Emma Hale, reportedly enabling him to acquire these same relics. See chapter 1. Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's a point at which you're supposed to take on certain responsibilities in the plan of God for, if you want to be a prophet, priest, and a king, well, the last one about being a king, got to get married. So, makes sense. So he's probably trying to say that he may have been dynastically married, allowing him access to the Nephite stuff, but then how would he get the in on the Mulekites? Well, good conjectures all around. Anyway, translations. Despite likely discovering the brother of Jared's encrypted record along with the Jaredite interpreters, it does not seem that Mosiah I undertook the effort to interpret them. As Ammon I told Limhi, the interpreters were to be used only by divine command, Mosiah 8:13. Thus, the mere possession of the interpreters and Jaredite record was no guarantee that Mosiah I would have translated that record. Furthermore, Ether 4:1 says that Benjamin, or his son Mosiah II, depending on the printing of the Book of Mormon, specifically withheld the brother of Jared's account from his people. An odd assertion if Mosiah I had already translated and withheld it from them a generation or two earlier. While Mosiah I may not have read the brother of Jared's record, there was another Jaredite record that he did read through the interpreters. Amaleki writes, quote, and it came to pass in the days of Mosiah, there was a large stone brought unto him with engravings on it, and he did interpret the engravings by the gift and power of God. And they gave an account of one Coriantumr, and the slaying of his people. And it also spake a few words concerning his fathers, and his first parents came out of the tower. At the time the Lord confounded the language of the people, and the severity of the Lord fell upon them according to his judgments, which are just, and their bones lay scattered in the land northward. See Omni 1:20-22. The record found and brought to King Mosiah I echoes a biblical account of the book of the law found in the temple and brought to young King Josiah, the father of Zedekiah. Upon reading the book, Josiah lamented that God's wrath was kindled against Israel because our fathers have not hearkened unto the words of this book, and to do according to unto all that which is written. That's 2 Kings 22:13. Acting as his people's proxy, Josiah covenanted in the temple that they would walk after the Lord and keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all their heart and with all their soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. That's chapter 23-3 of 2 Kings. Josiah's resulting reputation in the Bible was one who walked a straight path, turning neither to the right hand nor the left. 2 Chronicles 34:2. A zeal he displayed most notably in putting down the worship of idols, or possibly the other Christians who didn't want centralized power because of the Deuteronomists. You see, you can tell I have been thoroughly convinced of the Deuteronomists and the Josiah reform, and I think, unfortunately, Josiah was manipulated. Similar to, well, I mean, he was 8 years old when he came to the throne and trusted the scribes that were around him, and, well, instead of having individual families worshiping God, they wanted to centralize the power, etc. So I find it dubious. And so, while the content of the Jaredite stone and Josiah's book might have differed significantly, the warning was the same. Failure to live up to God's covenants in the promised land would result in the severity of the Lord falling upon them, according to his judgments, which are just. That's Omni 1:22. The Jaredite remains scattered about ominously testified to this. Now that I will give him. The main message of the plates and the stone and everything, saying, hey, if you don't listen, and you don't listen to God's commandments, you're going to get destroyed. I mean, that one's pretty obvious. The other thing about the Josiah reform that since to the victor goes the spoils in the writing of the history, I would... And there's a reason why he's still considered the bestest of all. Because if the scribes were consolidating their power and then they get taken over by Babylon and everyone comes back and says, dude, what happened? You instituted these reforms. We were supposed to be all righteous and great, and yet we still got taken over. They basically doubled down and said, well, you didn't listen to us enough? See, you really should listen to those scribes. So, anyway, like, that's the funny thing is that their zeal for keeping the commandments of God is great up to a point, but it's bad up to a point because Jesus Christ came back and said, look, you guys, seriously, you've got things wrong. Anyway. The idea is you had better keep the commandments of God or you will be destroyed. The Mosiah reform. Echoing Josiah, Mosiah led his people away from false worship in a defiled temple in the land of Nephi and taught the Amalekites to the worship of their forgotten God. As a reformer like Josiah, Mosiah... I don't like that Josiah comparison, but oh well, I'll let it slide. As a reformer like Josiah, Mosiah I reclaimed worship of the one true God for the Nephites and Amalekites. This reformation of Nephite and Amalekite religion may help explain one of the more curious passages among Joseph Smith's early revelations and the curious fate of that passage. The revelation that became Doctrine and Covenants 5 had an entire paragraph about a reformation omitted from publication. Oh, interesting. While Joseph Smith frequently and openly edited his revelations before publishing them, in the 1935 Doctrine and Covenants, such editing involved minor tweaks and the occasional addition of further revelation. Rarely did it involve the removal of revelatory content, and in one case did it mean the removal of a substantial and substantive text, this portion of Section 5. Originally directed at Martin Harris in March 1829, the revelation came a year after the loss of the initial Book of Mormon manuscript, and just as he and Joseph were beginning to resume the work of translation. To understand the portion that was removed, it may help to contextualize it with an adjoining portion that was retained in the published revelation. Quote, "Behold, I tell you these things, even as I also told the people of the destruction of Jerusalem, and my word shall be verified at this time, as it hath hitherto been verified." Doctrine and Covenants 5:20. No further explanation was given to Joseph and Martin to understand the warnings given to the people prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, likely because no further explanation was needed. To the translator and scribe of the lost manuscript, this evoked Lehi's warnings to the people of Jerusalem that stood at the head of the now lost pages. It would have also recalled the warning on the wall interpreted by Aminadi in Mosiah I's voice of warning to the people in the land of Nephi that came at the near end of the lost manuscript. Keeping in mind this narrative context from the lost manuscript, we can better understand the paragraph not included in the published revelation. The portion reads as follows, quote, "If the people of this generation harden not their hearts, I will work a reformation among them, and I will put down all lyings and deceivings and priestcraft and envyings and strifes and idolatries and sorceries and all manner of iniquities, and I will establish my church, yea, even the church which was taught by my disciples." That's Revelation, March 1829, Doctrine and Covenants 5. This content is not trivial and is instead quite substantive. It is also distinctive. Not merely repeating what is stated in other scripture, this revelatory text announces that God's work in the last days will enact a reformation and put down many specific forms of evil. So why was it removed from the published Doctrine and Covenants? The mystery of the removed passage is wrapped up with that of the stolen text of the Book of Mormon. The only scriptural text revealed to Joseph prior to this revelation that could have provided any context for it and its talk of reformation was the lost manuscript of the Book of Mormon. By this point, the only scriptural texts revealed to Joseph were two brief revelations, Doctrine and Covenants 3 and 4, that lack a reformation, and the lost pages that two brief revelations that lack a reformation, and the lost pages that ended with the complete story of King Mosiah I, who reformed the religious practice of both the Nephites and Mulekites. Without the Mosiahan context, the Reformation that would come to the mind of readers of the Revelation would be the Protestant Reformation, which does not align with the Reformation in the Revelation. The Book of Mormon was not intended to be a revision of existing Christianity like that of Martin Luther or John Calvin. It was meant to present a sea change in religion, like the reform of Lehi leaving Jerusalem and Mosiah I among the corrupt Nephites and apostate Mulekites, departure and restoration. However, with Mosiah I's reformation absent from the Book of Mormon, it would have been prudent to remove the allusion to his reformation from the Doctrine and Covenants to avoid evoking the Protestant Reformation as the model for God's latter-day work. Wow, that's a great point. The remainder of the removed paragraph coheres well with this explanation. The Reformation to be worked would put down a variety of evils, just like the Reformations of Mosiah and Josiah. 4 centuries before Mosiah I, King Josiah put down the idolatrous priests, and possibly the ones that didn't want to centralize the power of the scribes. Mosiah the First's Reformation similarly put down the idolatry of the Nephites and the Mulekites' denial of Israel's God. That one's I can get behind. Assuming that the revelation was pointing to Mosiah the First's efforts, then it offers another glimpse into the world of the lost pages, wherein the spiritual state of the people of Nephi before Mosiah the First was one of lying, deceiving, priestcraft, envying, strife, idolatry, and sorcery, and all manner of iniquities. Mosiah the First's reform and covenant. The Nephites' sins constituted a breaking of Lehi and Nephi's covenant, in which the Lord had promised prosperity and protection in return for his people keeping his commandments. When the Nephite nation broke the covenant completely, it was revoked and the nation destroyed. Yet why, when, and how was the Nephites' covenant with the Lord remade? Intriguingly, Mosiah the First's two biblical namesakes, Moses and Josiah, were covenant makers who put their people under covenant to keep God's law. Moses placed the children of Israel under covenant to keep the law at Sinai, and Josiah re-entered a covenant in the temple that his people would keep the commandments in the newfound book of the law. Deuteronomy? As a bearer of both these covenant legacies, it seems Mosiah the First entered his people into a covenant with the Lord that stood at the center of his reformation. Now, I have to admit, Josiah was probably had his heart in the right place, and that is a very good thing. It was the people around him I don't like. And how that ended up getting a lot of things changed, and not for the good, better, and probably being part of the reason Lehi left Jerusalem. But anyways, intriguingly, Mosiah's two biblical namesakes were covenant makers. Covenant with the Lord stood the center of it. Okay. Although any account of such covenant was lost with his story in the initial manuscript, echoes still survive when Benjamin perpetuated the legacy of my father Mosiah by appointing as king my son Mosiah, and reiterated his father's teachings. The people responded in a coordinated way. They all cried with one voice, declaring their willingness to enter a covenant, to be obedient to his God's commandments. Mosiah 5, 2-5. Far from a spontaneous outburst, these are the words which King Benjamin desired of them. And therefore he said unto them, Ye have spoken the words that I desired, and the covenant which ye have made is a righteous covenant. Verse 6. The people's ability to respond with the covenant Benjamin was seeking makes sense if there was a known precedent for such a covenant, that if Mosiah the First had previously placed the people under covenant, Benjamin noted the people's obedience to the commandments given through his father Mosiah the First as a covenant under which they had prospered. So he exhorted them to similar obedience to the commandments under his son, the new Mosiah. Quote, And I would that ye should do as ye have hitherto done, as ye have kept my commandments, and also the commandments of my father, and have prospered, and have been kept from falling into the hands of your enemies. Even so, if ye shall keep the commandments of my son, or the commandments of God, which shall be delivered unto you by him, ye shall prosper in the land, and your enemies shall have no power over you. Mosiah 2:31. As they came under the rule of a new Mosiah, the people recognized the renewal of a covenant they had made under the first King Mosiah. Further echoes of a covenant initiated by King Mosiah I appears in Joseph Smith's early revelations. Joseph's very first revelation after the manuscript loss, and his first known revelation given in the divine voice, thus saith the Lord, came in response to the manuscript loss in July 1828, and opens with the phrasing that echoes Josiah and his reform. The works and designs and purposes of God cannot be frustrated, neither can they come to naught. For God doth not walk in crooked paths, neither doth he turn to the right hand nor to the left, which has to do with Josiah. Neither doth he vary from that which he hath said. Therefore his paths are straight, and his course is one eternal round. That's Doctrine and Covenants 3, 1 through 2. It was Josiah who covenanted to walk with integrity to God's commandments, and who accordingly walked straight, veering neither to the right hand nor to the left. 2 Chronicles 3, 34-2. Yep. Why does Joseph Smith's very first revelation, received immediately after the translation of the now lost narratives of Mosiah I, begin by evoking the narrative of Josiah and his reform? Again, the only earlier written revelation to Joseph was the lost manuscript itself, culminating with the narrative of Mosiah I. Section 3 evidently alludes to the covenant walk of Josiah and his reform because those Josian themes had appeared powerfully in the Mosiah reform. Okay. All right. Yet another echo of Josian reform in connection with the Book of Mormon appears in Doctrine and Covenants 84. This revelation, given on the 5-year anniversary of Joseph receiving the plates, declares the saints under condemnation for treating lightly the New Covenant, even the Book of Mormon, when this revelation exhorts the saints not only to say, but to do according to that which I have written. Doctrine and Covenants 84:57. It quotes Josiah's explanation why his people were under condemnation for having not kept the commandments of the recently found book of the law. Great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not hearkened unto the words of this book, to do according unto all that which is written. 2 Kings 22:13. So, similar parallels again. The Book of Mormon is thus paralleled with the Book of the Law. Both these works of scriptures were found books, appearing after having been long missing, and each found book stood at the center of a reformation. The Book of the Law initiating Josiah's reformation, and the Book of Mormon initiating the Reformation or Restoration, announced in the earliest versions of the Doctrine and Covenants 5. The Book of Mormon also connects with Josiah's Book of the Law by presenting the account of Mosiah I and his Reformation and Covenant, a model for the Latter-day Reformation or Restoration it was to bring about. The Latter-day Saints were to be a covenant people on the model of the people of Mosiah I. As John W. Welch has shown, Benjamin and Mosiah II's covenant, and therefore their predecessor in Mosiah I's covenant, provided early forms of our sacrament covenant. You can see John W. Welch, Benjamin's covenant, as a precursor of the sacrament prayers for that reference. In the sacrament, we covenant to keep Christ's commandments and to take on his name, just as Benjamin had called his people to take on the name of Christ. Thus, as Welch further drives home in his essay, Our Nephite Sacrament Prayers, our Latter-day Sacrament prayers are Nephite prayers, the roots in the events of the reign of Benjamin, and thus Mosiah I before him. See, again, John W. Welch, Our Nephite Prayers, for that. And, well, yeah, that's true. In this light, God fulfilled his promise in the March 1829 revelation through the Book of Mormon. He enacted the Reformation described in the Book of Mormon, restoring covenant faith as practiced by Mosiah I. Benjamin, Mosiah II, and others. The Reformation of Mosiah I is thus not merely a matter of obscure history. While we do not know all the details of how it started, it has never ended. As Latter-day Saints, we are continuers of Mosiah I's Reformation. For Joseph Smith's continuing Reformation in Nauvoo, see Don Bradley, The Grand Fundamental Principles of Mormonism, Joseph Smith's Unfinished Reformation. Mosiah's Reform versus Josiah's Reform. The glimpses we can catch in our published Book of Mormon about Mosiah I's Reformation offers contrast with that led by Josiah. Mosiah I's Reformation echoed Josiah's, yet it also differed from it. In the Josian Reform, the Book of the Law was everything. Mosiah I's Reformation focused not on the book of Scripture, but on the means of revelation. More important to Mosiah I's reign than finding a book, which he apparently did not translate, was finding the interpreters, an instrument of revelation. This is important because Mosiah I was remembered not for his teachings on the law or a book, but for his teachings on the Spirit of God. See, I'm justified in saying the Josian reform is all about the law, the scribes. Whereas the intent of seeking God's will and revelation, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like it's been being taught a bunch recently by President Nelson, might be a kind of good indicator of be ready, have your sneakers on and take your vitamins. This contrast between the Josian reform and the Mosiah reform parallels a distinction between biblical Judaism, as it emerges out of the Josian reforms, and the Restoration faith taught by Joseph Smith. Mormonism begins in the Book of Mormon with Mosiah's, the first's reform. Biblical Jews are people of the book, grounding their faith in God's revelations contained in sacred texts. Latter-day Saints, like Mosiah I and the brother of Jared, are also a people of the book, but they're more fundamentally a people of living revelation, the process by which sacred books are revealed. Boom! Mic drop! Knowing Mosiah I again. The picture of Mosiah I's life that emerges from our available evidence is as follows. In the land of Nephi, under the reign of the final king of Nephi's dynasty, Mosiah I was called by God as a prophet to warn, like Lehi and Jeremiah, of coming destruction. He led the few who would listen on an exodus before the decisive Lamanite invasion. At the Lord's behest, he also rescued Nephi's relics, presumably taking them from the royal treasury by stratagem and likely assisted from within the royal family. Mosiah I used one of these relics, the Liahona, to guide his people through the wilderness and find refuge nearby at the hill north of Shiloh. Here they constructed a tabernacle to worship God outside the polluted temple of Nephi. Mosiah I preached and prophesied to his people, explaining why they had to abandon what had once been the Lord's temple, teaching them to resist the evil spirit that had come to inhabit that temple and could inhabit them, pointing them to the Messiah and placing them under personal covenant to keep the commandments. While encamped here, there Sinai, Mosiah I was led by the Liahona to the interpreters, which the Lord instructed him how to use in the tabernacle. Now replaced, the Liahona ceased functioning, and Mosiah I guided his people through the wilderness by the interpreters. Arriving in the land of Zarahemla, they encountered the Mulekites, descendants of David who had no scripture and had largely lost their Israelite identity. Mosiah I restored them to knowledge of their Hebrew tongue and Israel's God. Although the Mulekites had been ruled by Zarahemla, the heir of David, they saw in Mosiah I a seer, a rightful heir of Joseph, in whose promised land they lived, and a forerunner to the Messiah. Thus, they embraced him as their new ruler. The people of Nephi and the people of Zarahemla became together the people of Mosiah I. Mosiah I reformed the faith of both the Nephites and the Mulekites, restoring them from apostasy, serving his people as a prophet, as a priest, and as a king. Mosiah I constructed a new temple in which to worship Israel's God and receive higher truths, pointing them always towards their Messiah. It can be gleaned from Mosiah I's story. What can be gleaned from Mosiah I's story is both strikingly new and intimately familiar, as a story of apostasy and restoration, of covenant, of repentance, and of looking forward to the coming of Christ. It is also our story of the latter-day restoration. Though the full story of Mosiah I's great work is partly lost to us, its spirit is embodied in the faith of the Latter-day Saints. Typologically, we are the people of the ancient Mosiah, and theologically, we are the people of the living Messiah. Great way to end a chapter, right? Next will be the Book of Benjamin. I mean, I can't fault Josiah for wanting to bring people to God and live the law appropriately and properly, but as Don Bradley points out, and the other guys who specifically point out that it was likely the Deuteronomic revisionists of Josiah's time that basically tried to scrub all the direct and blatant prophecies of Jesus Christ from the Old Testament and take out the idea that, like the tree of life vision, that they knew his name, Jesus Christ. They knew he was going to be born of a virgin, and they knew that he was the Son of God. That rubbed them all the wrong way, and so they're like, well, we're going to scrub that out. Just like they are likely the ones who, on one page, you have Moses talking to God face to face, and then on the next page, he was talking to God face to face, but no one can talk to God face to face. There's a bunch of people that are like, yeah, that's likely where that came from. So, I understand the devotion to God. That's a good thing. The problem was it was their devotion to the book. Jonah Barnes, the guy who wrote the Key to the Keystone, is talking about the apocryphal writings that came after Joseph Smith's death with their discovery, which is funny because I was just reading Doctrine and Covenants 7 today. They talk about these other books that will come forward. And sure enough, I mean, you look at all these apocryphal writings, they didn't really come forward until after Joseph Smith and after his death. And, well, let me rephrase that. They didn't come to prominence or academic understanding and notability. Because, for example, there was a few apocryphal books that were found during the time of Joseph, but they were so esoteric and weird, they were held in private collections, and no one cared about them. They were just there. Jonah Barnes talks about how, I think it was the Book of Enoch or something, was one of the earliest ones. It was found during the time of Joseph Smith, but it was only had as a copy, not from the original, in England. It had never made it in circulation anywhere. And it didn't make it in circulation to America at all. And it wasn't until 10 years after Joseph Smith's martyrdom or something like that that finally someone was like, hey, we'd like to see about this Book of Enoch that you have. And someone's like, wait, what? You want to see our really weird book? So, the reason there's things that are important that way is because, again, people who are against the Church of Jesus Christ are like, well, there was a couple of books that were found. And it's like, yeah, but no one had access to them in all of America. And they weren't really well known about until long after he was, the translation of the Book of Mormon and his death in most cases. But now we're finding more and more and a plethora of them. So I can't wait to get to his book, but we'll get to the language of Adam next. So this will be the last chapter next, the Book of Benjamin. And after the Book of Benjamin, I think it's just a conclusion notes, insights from what was found. And that's it. Then it's the bibliography. So that's the bibliography there. So it's just this much. I think that's a day or two of reading. And, wow, we'll have crammed through it all. How nuts. I think this has been just absolutely illuminating so far. I especially love learning about Mosiah the First. I especially love learning about more details of Nephi and Lehi's exodus and how they were following certain patterns to not gain the favor of the Lord, although that's kind of part of it. It's more or less that they ended up following these specific patterns because that's the way of the Lord. I think that's an important thing, is that a lot of times people who are called on to be these righteous linchpins who lead people away to do the right thing, they end up following these same patterns because it's, again, a kind of beacon to anyone who's ready and willing to listen and to learn. It's like all these coincidences where, oh, let's see here, Joseph Smith brought the Book of Mormon out on the Feast of Trumpets and started translating them after 40 days of trial, and then he makes it to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and all these other things. It's like, I somehow doubt that Joseph Smith was steeped in Jewish tradition, like at all, other than what he was given by Moroni to sit there and say, hello, you're supposed to get it on this day and do these things and get this ready. And even then, I guess we don't have too many records on specifically what he was being taught by Moroni each year as he went back to the plates. Maybe he was just learning the stories about the Nephites from him, because it seems like that's what he would tell his family. But it's like, there's just so many patterns that he may have been unaware of, but yet still fulfilled to a T. It's just fascinating. And so I'm sitting here going like, yeah, if ever you have oh, gall. Yeah, because I am my father's son, I stumbled across a group that they seem to me a little more kind of fringe. They're not my cup of tea. They were talking about different revelations and visions that in general that they feel they've come across or had or that people have had. And they came across someone who said that their kid talked about there being an eclipse and then there's going to be wars and different stuff. And one of the hosts of this video on YouTube, he basically said he had a significant dream where he was talking to someone who seemed like a divine presence lady that was saying, hey, prepare for 2027 because the missionaries will be brought home then, and even though because of the wars and calamities that are going to start, but what they do is after they close the young missionary program, they'll start an older missionary program where married and older men will be called to serve missions, and the church will. Well, he described that the church will be able to live its full restoration and live the full covenants. To me, that meant that we might be living the law of consecration. Well, with the ability of the church now to do that is a lot more strengthened. It's not a terrible possibility. And to prepare for 2034. And, to me, that's fine and dandy. And I'm not going to deny them that they had important dreams. It made me start thinking of what if the church did something like that? What if in 2 years there was enough calamity and destruction happening in the world that they called back all of the young missionaries, only to then replace it by saying, all right, we're going to start doing this, that the older experienced married men who are ready and willing can go out on missions. That would be fascinating if that happened. So I think it'd be really cool. I think, to me, the reason I think they're a little more fringy is only because of not so much that they are, I don't know, I have a very slow approach to how the gifts of the Spirit manifest. Meaning that, if you're given something, sometimes there's some confirmation that you get, and we'll see. We'll see if we're right, And so that's the approach I would take with them, is just like, well, we'll see if they're right. We'll see if their dreams and their spiritual messages that they've received have any bearing. Because if they do, great. means that they're right and the Spirit of the Lord is being poured out. On the other hand, if they're wrong, it's like, oh, we're fallible human beings, but at least they're trying. And so that's kind of the way I approach the future prophetic types of claims, is along the lines of, well, we'll see. We'll see. Because I know when they lowered the date range for the missionaries to go from 19 for men down to 18, and from young women from like 21 down to 19. I know that was a big thing. Woo, yeah. And it was made waves through the church, and there was a huge influx of new missionaries, because, I mean, you had all the ones that were still at the normal original age, and then this huge group of younger that could now come just a little earlier. Any change in timelines like that is going to have an effect. But at the same time, it's like, that's not a huge step. Also, going from 3-hour church to 2-hour church is not a huge step in the big scheme of things. Like, when you get the church as a worldwide church making incremental steps like that, it's not that big. But something like, we're discontinuing all young missionaries and going back to kind of the original church where it's older missionaries that go, that would be big. That would be huge, because that is upending the pattern that's been set for a very long time of, hey, you're just getting out of high school, things like that, then you can spend 2 years on your mission, then come back and go on college. It's now, no, you can just go right on to college and still prepare yourself, because you got to get families going, and then you got to get, and if they're called back because of wars and calamities, maybe they have to get drafted. Things like that. It would make a lot of sense. And it would be pretty crazy for things like that to happen. But to me, it's funny that Don Bradley at the end of this chapter makes that point, that truly the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a people of ongoing and living revelation. I think we're seeing that more so now than at any other time. That not only do we believe in prophets and the gifts of the Spirit and things like that, but more importantly, for our own lives, we should be seeking God's directions. More for our own lives, we should adhere to His commandments and His covenants. So, that we should be a people of revelation, not just a people of a book. I think that's really, really important, because the scribes and those Josian reforms kind of put them on a path of having the book be their idol. And that's why they were so far away from the mark when Jesus Christ came. That He said, look, you guys have corrupted the law. You're, straining the widows and the orphans and all these other people, that you aren't getting it. We the builders of the nation. Sorry, that's what I was thinking of. I just muse at the end and I peter off, so I'll just call it here. Love you lots. Enjoy yourself. We'll see you around.